Was Karl Marx right? He actually was. Just letting you know ahead of time about everything. He's actually our God. We worship him because Marxism is a dogmatic faith where we believe that we will create a utopia that is heaven on earth tomorrow. So,
I should have
isn't
brought my
that
little
right?
Marx candle. Yeah, I should have brought my little Marx candle just to prove it. I left it in Carbondale, but I have this little Marx candle that I pray to every night. I get on my knees and I pray to the Marx candle.
I feel like I know what these guys are going to say already.
Yeah, yeah,
They're
yeah.
going to be like, Marx thought that he could create a utopia,
But Stalin.
but Stalin took Marxism and used it to kill everybody.
But you know what's funny? Before we started, somewhat related, but I've talked about often how in my class, in my intro to philosophy class, I teach in Carbondale. It's the poorest city in Illinois, and when I get to the Marx, Engels, Lenin, Mao sections of my intro to philosophy class, I also have J in there. People just get it. Like the common experience is that this is just putting words to something that I have felt that I knew for a very long time. It just helps me understand what I already understood better. So it ends up being like their favorite philosophers, their favorite thinkers. And I've been teaching for the last 2 semesters online, which means that I don't meet with the students. I just have to grade. It's the sort of gig that I have because I had a baby and stuff. So I've had to be away from Carbondale. But the difference has been tremendous when you don't have that uh, teaching guidance of people going through the text, of helping them break down and understand things. Because now, like the assignments, there's still those people that are replying, okay, this is opening my eyes, but it's so much less. And there's so many more that are just like responding to the prompts with the sort of archetypical myths about Marxism or communism in ways that are like statistically significant, a statistically significant difference than what it was in the previous like 2 3 years that I've been teaching the class. So it goes to show the importance of like guidance and it's not like I'm indoctrinating the kids. I'm not fucking doing that. I'm like helping them think through these texts, but it shows the importance of guidance in the process of thinking and overcoming some of the myths and the ideological entrenchment that people are in. It's not something usually that can be successfully done alone. It takes other people helping you through that process.
For sure, which is what we're hoping to facilitate with our upcoming classes. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Karl Marx is often described as one of the greatest thinkers of the 19th century. His writings have inspired revolutions and generated centuries of fierce debate. Born in Prussia, now
That's good at least. I hate when they say that, or people like Ben Shapiro say Marx should be erased from history. It's like, what? Aren't you the anti censorship guy? Like, Marx was really important to history. You just want him erased? Like, he's going to ignore everything? So at least they acknowledge that.
Right. And it's so incredibly degrading to a people when they're told that you shouldn't read this person because he's bad. But their philosophy has been influential in more than half of the world. You can say in the whole world, but it's basically succeeded at its height in half of the world and now in about like 35% of it. Um, so it's the most influential modern ideological framework because um, the liberalism that dominates in bourgeois philosophy, they at least pretend to trace it back to the classics, even though we've talked about a few times how there's very little connection with the classics of liberalism and what we have. It is like the most influential philosophical system, and um, I still feel like I have to, in a way, present an argument for why it is that these sorts of ideas should be taught in an intro to philosophy class when really, if you think about it, it's absurd to even have to propose that. But that's the sort of background of Red Scare and anti-communism in the U.S. that you just weren't allowed to read anything related to Marxism because you could lose your employment. There was a million and one things that they could do to you.
Well, what you should be reading, those kids, is Ayn Rand. Back in my day, we'd read Ayn Rand and we didn't have these problems.
Germany in May 1818, Marx believed that capitalism, which was in its infancy at the time, had serious flaws. Marx claimed that in pursuit of profit, capitalists would encourage their ideology that work is good, leisure is bad, and material things will make us happy, embracing mass production, depriving workers of job satisfaction, at the same time exploiting the working class. He became involved in the Communist League, a small group of intellectuals who wanted to abolish the class system and spread wealth equally.
Pause it.
He wrote the Communist Manifesto in
It's already a little better than the than one of the first ones that I reacted to, because that first one said that he joined the Communist Party, and it was kind of weird because the Communist parties are a thing of specifically Marxist parties, and it made it seem as if Marx joined a Marxist party before he was a Marxist. At least here, they call it for what it is, which is the Communist League, but that's still not correct. He joined the League of the Just, and then within a year with Engels, he basically staged a coup and moved it away from like the utopian socialism that they were entrenched in, and towards the scientific socialism that they had already begun developing. And they changed the name to the Communist League, and changed the slogan from "All men are brothers" to "Workers of the world unite." But before that, there was so much. It's so weird how one of the things that's constantly mentioned is um, that the sort of emphasis on Marxism as if it's a promotion of leisure, and that's always framed in like this very weird way, like that always fits into the stereotypes of like socialists are just lazy people that don't want to work, and they're just entitled lazy folks. When in reality, the problem that Marx had with work, or at least at its essence, was that it was exploitative and alienating. The problem wasn't with work itself. On the contrary, work was seen as something that's uniquely human, the sorts of activities where we can express ourselves creatively in the best ways we can, and ultimately, the most human sort of activity are the sorts of activities that we do when we objectify ourselves creatively and artistically onto nature in a social fashion. And that, in essence, was what work could be in a freer socialist society. So far from being like a condemnation of work and an elevation of the value of leisure, of the right to be lazy, it was at its core like a way of thinking about work as something that's freeing and that is actually within these specific social relations enslaving.
Plus, a little extra leisure time would be nice.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We don't want you working 12 hours, even regardless of how creative and fun it is. Some leisure would be good. Yeah.
7, with his benefactor Friedrich Engels, laying out the Marxist vision of a society where wealth is distributed evenly. Property is owned publicly, and
Pause it.
education is free.
Wealth is distributed equally. There you go. That's the other great myth. Socialism just wants to make everyone equal, and the socialists are the people that just want everyone to make the same amount of money as everyone else. And I remember when I first went into graduate school, I had a philosophy of race class, and there was one student in one of like the reaction posts that they did to one of the comments that I made, where I was like criticizing, the emphasis on race from like a bourgeois standpoint and the importance of like socialism for real black emancipation. Uh, they made a comment that was it said that even if you make everyone's income the same, you still haven't solved the race problem. I was like, this is so incredibly stupid. Like, come on, guys. This is graduate school, and you're talking about socialism being everyone makes $15 or whatever. Like, it's so deeply entrenched in these myths that have been created. They're so deeply entrenched in people's consciousness, and I mean, it's just false. It's demonstrably false. You look at any socialist state that has existed. There's been an inequality of income. Different labor has been valued socially differently, and so the remuneration for that type of labor has been different. You don't see the sort of differences that you have in the U.S., where like the average CEO makes 350 times more than the average worker, not even the lowest paid worker. But you do see a certain difference. In the Soviet Union, it was like a 10-to-1 ratio, and it's usually around that area. Now in China, it's a hell of a lot more. But what's done with the surplus benefits society. So that's, yeah.
For sure. I don't even know if I have anything else to add.
For all. But Marx was little known and little read at the time. When he died in 1883, only 11 people attended his funeral.
Is that true?
Yeah, there wasn't many people, but the people that were there were great people. So he had the creme de la creme there. To use Lenin's phrase, he had less but better. But just to go back to one of the other comments that it said, because I think it's important for our context and like the way that the social democrats that are portrayed as socialists today describe socialism, it's always focused on distribution. And that's one of the things that she mentioned. It's where the wealth of society is distributed equally. And that's not really correct. It's not that we're not observant of the way that wealth is distributed. Of course we are. But we try to look at what are the conditions for the possibility of this wealth being distributed in such a way. And what we find is that that moment of distribution, it presupposes the moment of production. And our essential concern, the essential concern is in what the relations of production are, how it is that groups of people are coming together to produce the things that that specific form of society ends up producing for various ends. And capitalism is for the end of profit, for realizing what's created in the form of profit for the capitalist. So it is out of that moment of production and the relations therein that the inequalities are found afterwards in the moment of distribution. So you hear all this talk about the income inequality. That's good. It's really good that we're talking about that, but we should see what that's grounded in, and it's grounded in the relations that guide how we produce under capitalism.
After his death, his ideas flourished. Based on the theory of Marxism came communism, the realization of a stateless society where
Communism pre-existed Marxism. He just made socialism scientific.
all are equal. Communism became a global movement, but the utopian ideal of a
Also, I don't know that Marx's version of communism would be a stateless society. I mean, after the Paris Commune, he comes up with the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, where you got to create a worker state. But
fair and equal society failed to materialize. Communism tyrannized and impoverished its.
At the very least, it's misleading because the ideal end is stateless, classless, moneyless society. But that's like phrased as, that's not going to happen next Tuesday. That's not going to happen right after the workers grab power. You need this period that, God knows how long it takes, of the dictatorship of the proletariat, where the state is controlled by workers and all the institutions are shaped such that they are there to ensure the continued existence of power in the hands of the working class. The bourgeois state is smashed. The bourgeois state is abolished. The working class state is created. And then with time, with the defeat of imperialism and with the natural, organic abolition of classes within civil society, you have the withering away of the state. And that's where you get the final goal.
it withers.
Yeah. It Bill withers. Because there's no sunshine when communism is gone.
Are these the people who were tyrannized under communism, or who were smashed under communism? Because these people all look rich as hell. And in places where communism took hold, like China and the Soviet Union, people were starving. People were, being sent to fight and die in imperialist wars. So
That's
yeah,
the family.
they probably did get rid of these rich assholes.
Those are the subjects of the comments that are made about my family had its property taken away under caste right communism.
Right.
Totalitarianism.
These are the people who lost their plantations, and now you have to be anti-communist otherwise. pure evil.
Subjects and slaughtered them in the tens of millions. Today, capitalism
The tens of millions. I'm not even going to go into that. The freaking Black Book of Communism's own authors said that was stupid.
dominates the world. But many of Marx's criticisms have never been more relevant. Today, the global disparity between rich and poor is striking. Marx predicted that capitalism would lead
Was
to
that?
the richer and the poor.
This is the best way to explain the withering away of the state. You just keep on using me until you use me up, That's a
Drop
proletariat.
it.
It becomes superfluous and it withers away. And then Bill Withers is reincarnated, and that's how you know you've hit communism. But now they're going to do this thing that they always do, which is, but here's how Marx is valuable today, and that it's so effective because it makes them seem neutral and objective. And here's some good stuff, and here's some bad stuff, and then the balance is like, the bad stuff is there was 3 billion people killed under communism. The good stuff is he was right about income inequality or something like that. um, but that's the Marxism that's safe, right? Regardless of the form it takes, whether it's an Economist video saying, here's where Marx was good and here's where he's not, or whether it's Slavoj Žižek calling himself a Marxist but condemning every single socialist experiment that has ever existed. It's the Marxism that says that every single socialism that has existed has been abhorrent, has been a big failure, a big mistake. Crimes against humanity have been made, or it wasn't actually socialism. That's the Marxism that's accepted everywhere. It's not only accepted, it's promoted, it's uplifted. That's what they need, because that's the safe, compatible Marxism. That's the purity fetish Marxism that they appreciate.
Yeah, it's an idealist Marxism. It's Marxism, but I hate all Marxist revolutions. It's Marxism, but I'm not going to fight for a revolution. Like, well, then what's the hell's the point? What's the point of being a Marxist then if you don't want to make the world better?
To bring up the example that Zizek gives paradoxically, it's it's like coffee without caffeine. It's like Marxism without like the soul of Marxism.
It is. It's Marxism without practice, or Marxism without materialism.
Poor. He was right. He also predicted that capitalism would lead to boom and bust economics. Marx predicted that capitalism would lead to globalization, and that a handful of firms would have huge market dominance. However, Marx...
So he got everything right, but somehow he killed 10 million people while doing it. And he was right about the capitalists controlling the media and the education system, but they're definitely not lying to us about those communist countries.
What they are the media that they're admitting that he was right about, by the way.
Yes, true. They conglomerated, all the corporations have conglomerated, including the media and us, which is why we're lying to you right now.
Lenin was right. They are the newspaper of the British bourgeoisie.
Yep.
Underestimated the ability of capitalism to make everybody richer by making products much cheaper.
That's not true. He knew it was an incredibly productive system. He knew that, and he knew it was a system that would increasingly mass produce commodities, and would develop in that way, and that the fixed capital would increasingly increase in proportion. There would be increased production in terms of like an absolute scale. And that's kind of the role that even though, in imperialist countries, we have seen decay and a lot of deindustrialization and, deindustrialization due to imperialism in general, holding the productive forces back. But in a way, that's sort of the role that capitalism plays historically, is building up and expanding the productive forces and this fixed capital that can then be seized and made public and used to benefit the whole of society.
I want to address this question by Shaya Bat CV. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong.
Okay, I'm going to grab some water while you do that.
Sounds good. And I feel like we didn't we aren't being perhaps as thorough as we could be, because it happens that at times it just feels weird to be so repetitive, and a lot of these things we talk about literally in every stream. But just a quick off the hip answer for the importance of defending socialist countries, the USSR, China, etc. One is because ideally we would want a commitment to the truth. Aristotle says in his first line of his Metaphysics that all men by nature desire to know, and what they desire to know is the truth. And the truth is that socialism has been incredibly successful. It's lifted hundreds of millions, if not a billion at least, people out of extreme poverty and has civilized, swaths of people like never before done. And it's built tremendous wealth and lifted the living standards of hundreds of millions of people without having to do any of the things that capitalism did to develop its wealth, namely the genocide of the indigenous, colonization, enslavement of the African peoples, et cetera, et cetera, and while developing that wealth under constant imperialist hybrid warfare. Remember that the Soviet Union was for the next, at least until 1945 and the Korean Revolution, it was for a good 3 decades the only socialist country in the world, which means that it had basically the whole capitalist world against it. And just the fact that it even survived is a very impressive feat with the amounts of spies and different spies that it had within the Soviet Union from other countries trying to undermine it from within, and all the plethora of attacks that it faced, and the literal world war that it had to fight, defeat fascism in. And people forget that the West was hoping that Hitler would devour the Soviet Union very much. And even though Stalin from the early 30s was warning the West about Hitler and hoping to create a pact to defeat Hitler, the West did not want that. It wanted the Hitlerite forces to win and to beat the Soviet Union very quickly. And thankfully, that didn't happen. But so that's one of them, a commitment to truth. The other one is as socialists, as people who want to radically alter the current state of affairs. We can't do that if we accept the big myth about socialism that's been fed to us by McCarthyism and Red Scare anti-communist propaganda, which is that socialism has always failed. If we participate in the sort of activity that's archetypical of the Western Marxist purity fetishists, which is that we're critical of capitalism, but we accept its narrative about socialism always failing, we're never going to be able to organize our working classes at home. If you go to working people and you tell them, everything that they told you about the USSR, China, Cuba, etc., is correct, but we, the virtuous West, the virtuous Americans, we're the ones that are going to get socialism right, no one's going to follow you. They have to be as stupid as you are to follow you. So they're going to follow you when you tell them the truth about socialist countries and you explain how there's been tremendous successes, even though there's been tremendous pressure on it to not be successful. And when you explain to them, especially within the imperialist core, how successful socialism could be for them, how much of an improvement it could be on their everyday life, because of the fact that if we have a revolution in the US, there wouldn't be the US to wage hybrid warfare against us. So those are just, I guess, two reasons why, but there's a plethora of other reasons which we're usually bringing up in our different streams. So
For sure. This is interesting. Seriously, why won't the Economist talk about Marx was writing about their articles during the American Civil War? Oh, yeah, because he organized cotton strikes that made a British invasion powerless. I didn't know that.
yeah.
That's very, very interesting piece of history.
The first international they made massive. It was prompted after the Gettysburg Address and after the visit to Britain of Frederick Douglass, um, uh, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Wendell Phillips. They went to Britain, and in the eve of all of that, the already sympathetic working classes of Britain, when they saw that it was a war basically to emancipate a type of labor from a type of capital, they completely launched themselves into the streets in order to protest the intervention of Britain on the side of the southern slave planter oligarchic class. So, just keep this in mind as you listen to narratives about the reactionary or counter revolutionary character of the 1776 revolution, which always implies a somewhat progressive character of the British crown. Um, uh, when it comes to the question of slavery, remember that in 1865 ish, or in the 1860s, when the Civil War was taking place, Britain was going to intervene for the sake of the slave owning class, and didn't because of its own working class, which was led ideologically by the First International and Karl Marx.
Since the 1980s, the number of people in absolute poverty has fallen by about 1 billion. He also got wrong the capacity of...
Do you want to debunk the poverty thing? I've done that a million times, but
Yeah, that's what's difficult about these videos. That they're helpful, but from the standpoint of our sanity, it means that we're constantly having to repeat a bunch of things. But repetitio est mater studiorum. It's an old Latin dictum which says repetition is the mother of all knowledge. And I think that we've both experienced that as true. At some point, we need to hear things a few times before we learn them. So I do think it's important to repeat ourselves, especially when it comes to these topics. So I would say we should go for it and debunk the narrative that the lowering of poverty is the result of capitalism. I don't know. Do you want to take the first stab at that one, and then I can maybe piggyback off of whatever I feel like is left out?
yeah, I mean, it's hard to go into their specific statistics without being able to lay them out. I know we had a professor who would show us. There's a famous video where this guy says that global poverty has been decreasing over time. And if you tweak the statistics, you can make it look like poverty's been decreasing over time, but largely it hasn't, or largely there's still been giant swaths of people who remain in poverty throughout time and throughout capitalism's development. Depending on how you lay out the statistics, and I'm sure you can do that with theirs too, but I mean, of course, there's millions of people dying every year due to starvation and lack of health care. If you look at the richest places in America that capitalists hegemon, there's giant sources of wealth like Wall Street and giant skyscrapers in New York. But then there's also people living on the streets and people sleeping in the subways and, decay of the city in various ways. So where capitalism creates great wealth, it also creates great poverty. So there's this myth that eventually poverty will hit zero, and it's not happening anywhere except socialist China, where they're also industrializing the global south and helping African countries and Latin American countries and countries in the Middle East who have long had their productive forces held arrested by imperialism. They're having their productive forces developed by these Belt and Road loans, which only build equity, which is money that creates more money. So basically fixed capital in these countries. And that, in fact, is actually bringing people out of poverty. And China has, in fact, eradicated extreme poverty, which the UN is now studying because it is such a terrific achievement. So to the extent that you see poverty decreasing more and more, around these times, that has a lot to do with China's poverty alleviation programs. Because if you think, there's over 1 billion people in their country alone who they brought out of poverty. And that's not even to mention the Belt and Road Initiative and the effect that that's had.
Yeah, I would even say it's perhaps going even before the 2000s, because the 800 million people that have been lifted out of poverty in China has been since reform and opening up. Um, what's often left out is that from the founding of the PRC to the period of reform and opening up, so from 49 to 78, in that stretch of 29 years, China, the life expectancy of the average Chinese increased by 32 years, which is more than a year per year. And that's the fastest, as John Ross reports in his book on China, that's the fastest increase in life expectancy in the history of humanity. So one thing that's left out is that a lot of these developments in and people's living standards and lifting people out of poverty have been done by socialist states, as you mentioned. The other thing is that the ones that have occurred within capitalist countries, they haven't been handed over by the capitalists. It's not the capitalists that are like, I don't like poverty. Let's lift these people out of poverty. Let's give them better wages. I don't know. No, it's been working class people coming together, usually in the form of either militant trade unions or communist or socialist parties, coming together and threatening revolutionary activity. And in the face of that threat, the capitalists hand out meager concessions to working class people in the forms of reforms that lift their living standard, at least for a period of time. What we found in the US is that those reforms have been progressively pulled back since at least 1947 with the Taft-Hartley bill, and definitely it's been accelerated since the 1970s and the emergence of neoliberal financialized capitalism. But everything that they're pointing to as a statistic that proves Marx is wrong just proves that the class struggle works in lifting the living standard of people, both within projects that have won socialism and within projects that are still struggling for
Yeah, we did it.
it.
We debunked the stupid.
He also got wrong the capacity of capitalism to reform itself by creating welfare states that redistributed wealth through taxation.
Just read the fucking chapter on class struggle in Capital Volume 1. It's like the first chapter that's actually easy to read in that book. And he's just talking about how when the workers start getting organized and they struggle, or maybe it's the chapter on the working day, not the class struggle.
Yeah, it's chapter 10, sorry.
Yeah, the working day, where he's talking about, how the workers can struggle when they get together, they can demand political reforms. And how there's a dialectic between labor and capital, and they're in constant battle. And when the workers get organized, they can demand reforms, and they can demand that the government give them things like welfare programs.
And that's all they've given them, right? Again, the same thing with the poverty. It's been, these are struggles that have been won. Nothing has been won without struggle, as Frederick Douglass used to say.
Although there is a lot to learn from Marx, his solution was far worse than the disease. At the same time, it can't be said that today's capitalism, dominated by immense inequality and financial crises, has triumphed.
It's like they know they're going to lose.
Right.
It's like that's why the ruling class is so terrified of Marxism. They're like, we know eventually you'll figure out that he was right and you'll overthrow us. But for now, we're on top, baby. Popping bottles.
Oh my God. Yeah. I'm just waiting for, well, if this doesn't work, and if the only sensible alternative is, in your idea, far worse, then what are we doing? It's just back to Churchill's dictum, which again, the Economist British newspaper, which is that capitalism is the worst system except for all the other ones, right? Or there is no alternative, or the end of history, anything from Thatcher to Fukuyama. It's bullshit. It's the same thing as Ursula Le Guin used to say. It's the same thing that the slave owners said. It's the same thing that the lords said. They always believed that their system was eternal, and that the relations of production which guided their societies and their form of life will be eternal, and that their right to govern over the producers, the workers, would be eternal. And then history proved literally every single one of them wrong. And history has proved the capitalists wrong in a big chunk of the earth. And it's just pending, if you are sensible enough to see these tendencies objectively, it's just pending in the other areas.
Absolutely. I don't get. When did Fukuyama write the end of history thing? That always perplexes me, and I know he walked it back later in life. That's just such an arrogant thing to say, but like the Iranian Revolution was 1979, isn't? I mean, that had to be before he wrote that book.
I'm going to check
I
specifically. It
don't know.
was
That's a
with the
little bit of a
fall of the Berlin
sidetrack.
Wall.
What's that?
Yeah, I wanted to say it was with the fall of the Berlin Wall, but it could have been later on. It's 92. But
92.
92 is the book. I wonder if I remember I think it was an article first, so it could have been after, but it was definitely after in that period that was very clear that the Soviet Union was gonna just fall, um, be overthrown, basically.
Right. And everyone had written China off as capitalist at the time.
But what's funny is that it plays on like a very bad reading of Hegel's philosophy of history, and the typical I've never read Hegel, but I'm going to dismiss him argument is that we get to the end of history, and the end of history is a Prussian state, and we're not moving anywhere after that. And that's, of course, wrong because Hegel is measuring history according to the notion of freedom. And he only says that in the sense that we have achieved a notion of freedom with the Enlightenment, that is, that all men are free. So all people are free. So we have the notion here. We're pending its realization. But the end of history, in that sense, from the standpoint of like the understanding of freedom, it's no longer the case that only one is free, the God, or only some are free, the select caste of special people. Now we understand that all are free. So that's what he meant by it. But Hegel's been so dismissed in the Anglo American academic world, and then you have this like butchered caricature of Hegel's understanding of the end of history used to describe the end of history with the overthrow of the Soviet Union, at a period where Cuba was still around, the DPRK was still around, China was obviously still around, but even many respectable comrades like Parenti were skeptical of China's socialism. It was called the Wild '90s for a reason. But you had tremendous struggles all over Latin America. That's when neoliberalism was really people in Latin America were beginning to feel the effects of neoliberalism and organizing all over the place against it. And they wouldn't really win until like the early 2000s with the pink wave, but um, you had to have had an extremely narrow view of the world to say that this is the end of history. You're making the mistake that they were making, quite literally a mistake that they say that Hegel makes, but that Hegel actually doesn't make.
Interesting.